Okay, so I cut off part one because I messed up at the end. So let me just start over. And it's still kind of early in the morning, so I'm just going to do mostly reading from my notes that I made this morning to try to wrap this up. So basically I left off where there's a diagram of our knowledge, and somewhere in that is our knowledge of how these things were made. And it's kind of an indirect way of going about finding the right way, because we don't know, we may not know that that is specifically the right way. It's just within our knowledge, and that's good enough for me. So the philosophical point of view would be, the greater our knowledge, the greater the chance for being aware of the way things were done. Pursuit of the exact method is less important than the expansion of our knowledge. So I'll just leave it at that. The other thing I wanted to cover is something called material culture, and a lot of the literature is devoted to developing these types of cultures based on how things were made and what they look like, and different campsites that contain the same materials at the same level. Not the same materials, but contain materials at the same level of occupation, and the soil has been dated, and let's say that's 5,000 years old, this particular site, and all these sites are around 5,000 years old. And what they do is they look at this, and this is a material culture here because it's all grouped together, it's all aged the same, and it may include arrowheads and pottery and other tools. Okay, now the reason why that's useful when you start to define these material cultures is because you can compare them to other sites. Now other sites may or may not have these same items, they may be all mixed together, and archaeologists try to make sense of, who's related to who. I mean, this site could be a temporary camp of these people, and these, let's say this is a river or something, these might be totally different in culture because these objects look different than these. Now let's say they have one little object in here that matches this object. They try to figure out, there's nothing else that matches except these two, so maybe they were trading with each other, and that kind of thing. Now there is an issue that I kind of disagree with when it comes to material culture, and that is when they start to define technologies. Okay. Now the technology is how these things were made, and they're trying to incorporate these technologies into these cultures, and that's where I think they get on shaky ground, because as I said previously in the other video, this type of pursuit is not really valid in my view, because we don't know enough, or we see these things through modern bias and so forth. But nevertheless, I'm seeing more and more of this, where the technology itself even starts to define the culture, the way things were made, not just the way they look or how they're associated, but the way they were made is also part of the culture. And they're thinking that, cultural forces are influencing how these things were made, and so forth and so on, which is fine, but it's kind of shaky ground. That's all I'm trying to say. And these cultures can also be related not only across space like this, but across time as well. Like this, in a younger layer, let's say 3,000 years, we still find the same items here and here. So we're thinking that, over time these cultures didn't change very much, they stayed the same. So not only is the material culture studied across space, but also across time. Now let's say that we know how this thing was made, and we make an assumption that we're 90% accurate. let's just say. There are certain questions that I have that I'll be expanding upon in later videos, and I'll be thinking about and as topics for later videos. And just some questions for you guys to think about. Let's see here. Alright, just basic questions. Does that mean objects made the same way belong to the same culture? Not necessarily. The answer to that one for me is not necessarily. Just because these were made in the same way doesn't mean that they're in the same culture. You know, that's pretty obvious. All the other objects are different, so maybe they were trading, or maybe they have you know, a family of flint knappers here that split up and one went over here, and they made the same objects in these two areas. Okay, so that's one thing to consider. Does that mean objects not made the same way are less important? Which is a more interesting question, because let's say that this group over here okay, all these other objects are the same, but these are slightly different. These arrowheads in here, slightly different, or maybe even totally different. Does that mean that these are different cultures? Okay, how much importance are we putting on the stone tools there? A lot of times all we have is the stone tool, and we don't have anything else. Okay, and we get into a situation where we're thinking, okay, that's different than that. It must be a different culture. Well, it's not necessarily so, in my view. Just because it's different it belongs to a different culture. And there's a lot of this going on where people are separating these stone tools by very minute characteristics and slight variations, and saying that there are different point styles, there are different cultures, and the technologies are different. So, you know, all this stuff's going on, and they're starting to name these things. And in my view, they're doing this way too early, or they're ignoring the other items in these sites, or both, just so they can, you know, try to make sense and group these things, or split these things up and categorize them and so forth. So to me, this is a more interesting question than the first one. If objects are not made the same way, are they less important? And also there's how do we account for differences in skill? How do we account for human conditions like boredom, being tired, lack of vision, eyesight caused by age, etc.? So just to wrap it up here, I made some diagrams in here to illustrate the point that, you know, some of these items may look the same, but we should also be looking at other items to determine material cultures. And some notes here. How do we account for differences in other items? Does stone technology become less important or more important than other technologies in material culture? And questions like that. Okay, so I've got to go. I've got to wrap this up, but I'll expand on this in future videos, and hopefully that made sense. And okay, that's it for now.